podcast. I'm Karen Weaver. It's January 2026, and the podcast audience continues to grow. Some of you may not know that these podcasts are also on YouTube. If you watch or listen there, I have opened up a community conversation thread to hear from you. I'm asking a simple question. How can we fix college sports, especially if Congress doesn't come through? What is the future for D1, D2, and D3? I'd love to get a dialogue going on the YouTube podcast site. Check it out and add your 2 cents. College sports, as we all know, are entering a new era. With the landmark House v. NCAA settlement, universities across the country can now pay student athletes, shifting a system that once rooted in amateurism toward revenue sharing, roster limits, and serious financial strategy. S&P Global's latest analysis explores how these changes are reshaping budgets, fundraising, and competitive dynamics across Division I athletics, especially among the Power 4 institutions. And it also raises about big questions about who can keep up and at what cost. My guests today provide financial analysis of the entire sector of higher education. Beth Bishop and Ken Rodgers wrote one of the very first reports on the impact of the House settlement on the sector as it stands today. Beth and Ken, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Karen. Nice to be here.
Karen. So, as we were prepping for this, of course, breaking news came across the terminal, or whatever you want to call it, regarding a gambling scandal that just broke. Actually came out of the Eastern District of Pennsylvania, which is here in Philadelphia, where we have 20 or so athletes involved, many of them college athletes, in a number of areas with institutions that you wouldn't think about. Schools like Kennesaw State, Abilene Christian. So these are not high level. These are the next level institutions. Let's talk a little bit about what your concerns are and how this might factor into your analysis going forward. And Ken, I'll let you start.
Well, I think, thanks again, Karen, for inviting Beth and I. And Beth was the lead author on this article, so I want to make sure that she has the most opportunity to address your comments. But I'll just quickly add on this issue, since it's late breaking, so to speak. It's not the first time this has happened. I actually got involved in my interest in college sports from a financial perspective, if you will. Ratings perspective came about as back in 2016. So 10 years ago, University of Louisville, you may recall, was involved in a basketball scandal having to do with the bribery and related matters. And in particular, the sports, the shoe company Adidas was involved in to some degree in that. And so it was a big, long process that took place, and then that sort of morphed into something else that I'll just recommend to your viewers or listeners. A book, again in Pennsylvania. The initial person that involved in this is a book called Hot Dog Money by Guy Lawson. I suggest read it because it's a great sort of give background into some of these basketball college scandals. That particular book was written about an individual that was a financial investment advisor in the Pittsburgh market named Marty Blazer. And he got involved with basically through his investment advisory work with a number of college athletes, and basically things went the wrong way in terms of the types of activities. I should issue one caveat to your listeners, and this is not a PG rated book, so just keep that in mind when you read it. But I think what this scandal, like today, we don't know the full extent of it yet, but what it raises is the issue of what we refer to as headline risk. From a credit perspective. And headline risk seems to be something that, within the past couple of years, more and more colleges and universities are being faced with this headline risk and potential reputational damage, and then the impact that can have. That's what our interest is in all this and our perspective. So I'll be quiet and let Beth may have a few things to add.
Go ahead, Beth.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with Ken. The headline risk is probably the number one issue at this point, right? We don't know the full extent of how things are going to play out or the full extent of the the law breaking, if you will. And a few of these schools that they mentioned in the article that came out was a few of them we rate and a few of them we don't. So there's some mixed, a sort of a mixed bag there when it comes from a rating perspective. But I think another thing that's a concern for me that is not necessarily surprising, but is concerning, is that a lot of these schools, as you mentioned, Karen, are sort of the mid major, if you will. And so I think that, sometimes those are the schools that struggle more with demand issues, with financial operations. Not always. I don't want to, make a blanket statement, but yeah, I think sometimes those schools are the ones that are already struggling a bit, maybe using athletics as a demand driver, maybe are kind of scraping by to see how they're going to deal with revenue sharing and things like that. And so kind of tossing this on top of that headline risk, along with, potentially ineligible players, things like that. There's so many factors here. I think that's another thing that I'm thinking about.
Yeah. So help our listeners understand what you're rating. And you're not the only rating agency that's out there.
Right.
But what does this mean for, liquidity, for borrowing, generally for the college, and sustainability? What do your ratings mean in that area?
Yeah, that's a good question. Certainly, our ratings. We rate a variety of institutions across the board. We certainly don't rate every institution that exists, but we rate institutions from 500 to 600 students to 50, 60, 70,000 students, and sometimes more depending on the institution. Really wide range of ratings here. And I think liquidity, you mentioned liquidity, that dinged in my head because it's something we're really focusing on right now, something we're really making sure we're paying attention to, asking a lot of questions about, because there are institutions and there are examples of institutions that have $150 million endowments, which sounds pretty solid, but none of that is liquid. There's covenant violations even if you have a large endowment. So I think you mentioned liquidity, so I'll just say that's something we're looking at right now. But from a long-term perspective, we just released our outlook for this sector, for the higher education sector, and we went negative this year. And I think that's just reflective of things happening on the federal level, things happening with international students, things happening from an athletics perspective. There's just a lot. There are a lot of headwinds right now, and I think our ratings, particularly in the coming year, will certainly reflect that.
A lot of budgetary pressures.
Absolutely.
Okay, so let's talk about what that means if I'm a school and I need to borrow money. If my rating falls, walk us through what's the top rating the best possible, and what's the lowest, and where do many schools fall?
Yeah, so the top rating is AAA. I feel like a lot of people are familiar with that. AAA is our highest rating at S&P. And then the lowest rating, I suppose, technically would be D, Ken, if I'm not mistaken. And usually that's reserved for those who are in default. So default meaning could mean a variety of things. Usually means you can't make your debt payments. The majority of our borrowers fall somewhere in the middle. I don't know, Ken might know better than I do the exact sort of breakout of, I don't have that off the top of my head, but the majority of our issuers fall between in investment grade. So investment grade is anything from triple B minus to AAA. The majority of our issuers fall in investment grade. And there's a variety of, every rating category from triple B minus up to AAA. We've got issuers in each camp. And then we have a host of issuers that are speculative grade, which is what we consider under triple B minus. So double B plus, double B minus, all the way down to D. But that's a much smaller portion of our portfolio.
We rate over 400 colleges and universities. Most of the private universities, the median ratio, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, is in the A category. And for the publics, it's in the AA category.
Okay. All right. So
the significance is for AAA means basically exceedingly strong ability to repay your debt and interest, your debt payments on a timely basis. AA is very strong. A category is strong, and triple B category is adequate.
Okay. And how often are these ratings updated or changed?
We review all of our ratings every 12 to 15 months. Okay. So depending on our portfolio management, we try to get to them. We do have regulatory requirements of timelines within which we have to review. But we're generally pretty good as a team, not to toot our own horns, we're generally pretty good as a team of reviewing things every 12 to 15 months. It usually kind of pushes more towards the 14 to 15 month mark. But yeah, we review them relatively frequently, the whole portfolio.
So you mentioned the headline, right? The headline in this particular gambling case. If you're evaluating them over 12 to 15 months, does the headline have to reappear and just keep coming up every couple of months to kind of keep the institutions and the media, and that's the impact? Or is one really bad headline going to impact the next year or 2 years of ratings?
I think the answer to that is yes to both of those.
Okay.
Certainly, if there's, I think, a headline like this, if there's a school that's involved in this that I'm talking to 6 months from now, this is probably something I'm going to bring up with them, even though maybe it's not recurring in the news. If it's kind of a one-off, maybe something smaller, maybe they've laid off some faculty and there was a headline about that. Maybe something happened in the town that maybe affects, if it's a small, sort of in a college town that affects the university, maybe we ask them about it. But yeah, I think both of those things. If it's something that keeps coming up, certainly something we want to talk about. But something like this, or any kind of scandal that involves, there's been a whole host of sexual assault scandals at certain universities over time, gambling, you name it, anything like that, we'll definitely want to ask about.
Anything that involves litigation oftentimes is a multi-year exposure, if you will, for the institution, because that's how long it takes to wind through the court system oftentimes. So I mentioned earlier, University of Louisville, I think we had conversations with them about what had taken place probably for 2 or 3 years when the Beth mentioned the Penn State, when the situation there with the sexual scandal they had a number of years ago. We probably talked to them, 4, 5, 6 years, consecutively about that. And, even though it may have been out of the headlines, like Beth was just suggesting, it was only in the headlines maybe for 3 or 4 years. Some of the legal aspects of it continued on for a period of time.
Something I'll mention as well is that it continues to show up in our reports for several years. And sometimes it's not even something we're talking to them about in that particular year. But if it's something that we wrote about last year initially, if it's something we think is important, it'll show up in our reports kind of year over year until we feel like the risk has either faded enough that we don't need to write about it anymore, or they've taken certain measures to mitigate that risk.
Okay, that's really helpful.
A lot of how we react to it, oftentimes will have to do with how a big part of our credit analysis is the evaluation of management and governance of the organization. Okay. So a lot depends on how the management and governance of the organization addresses the issue. Some will be forthright about the issue and try and, get to the bottom of it and quickly. Others perhaps not so, for a variety of reasons.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so that leads me right into the House settlement with the NCAA. Here we have something that was primarily targeted to the Power Four conferences plus Notre Dame, and also schools that decided to opt in. That's a huge financial risk for all of those schools in order to be competitive in that environment. I think about not just the Michigans and Ohio States, but I think about the other schools that are outside of those conferences that want to be in those conferences, but they're taking financial risks right now. Perhaps they're preparing a grand master plan where they double their enrollment and they, create perhaps a deal with all kinds of alumni to donate back into the program. How do you assess risk in this environment?
Yeah, it's tough. It's been tough. I think, I think we said this in our initial conversation a few weeks ago, but my take on it is we have to ask a lot more questions. We're asking a lot more questions. I think Ken mentioned this as well. 3, 4, 5 years ago, and certainly before that, we weren't really talking about athletics.
Yeah.
It wasn't really something that was a part of our agenda. Not that we didn't care about it, and not that it wasn't mentioned in meetings, but it certainly wasn't something that we were focused on, or something that we thought was driving change, driving demand, driving budget impact. And now, it's on every one of my agendas now. I talked to my colleagues. I sent an email out to our colleagues last week saying, hey, if you've talked to a school and they said something interesting let me know. I want to know what they're saying. And so I think the big thing is asking a lot of questions, and asking specifically, if for schools that did opt in to revenue sharing, how are you going to pay for this? What does your budget look like? What are your expectations? What does the transfer portal look like? I think there's a lot more specific questions that we're asking. And I think we're seeing, and Ken, curious what your thoughts are here as well. I think we're seeing the ability for schools to answer pretty high. I mean, I would say most schools, at least that I've spoken to and that some of our colleagues have spoken to, have been able to answer these questions. Whereas, again, maybe 4 or 5 years ago, they would have to say, I got to talk to our athletic department about that. I'm not really involved in athletics.
Okay.
Yeah, I would say that the only thing I would add is just that, for colleges and universities, particularly now when budgets are stressed, one of the most important aspects of their operations is fundraising. And, it's the president of the college or university that, is oftentimes in the best position relative to advancing the fundraising agenda of that particular institution. And so that's what these presidents do these days. They spend a lot of time on the road meeting with various constituents, if you will, that can aid in the fundraising campaigns that they undertake. And so as all this has unfolded, if they weren't already, many of them had to be by necessity, particularly the larger public schools, for example, public universities, colleges. They had to become really well versed in the athletics aspects. And I'm sure they've probably had numerous conversations with their general counsel in-house to make sure that, they don't go off script, to get the institution in trouble about some of the issues as they're pressed on some of these matters by, alumni and others that have an interest in supporting the athletic programs.
So in your wonderful article, which I encourage people to go on S&P Global's website to read, it's from October, you talked about you're watching the impacts on institutional operations, demand, and fundraising. One of the things that I'm paying attention to is, besides student fees, where else are institutions gathering money to be able to redirect athletics to survive in this world? Have you been able to identify some areas where you're seeing some stress because the financial resources are being directed other places, specifically athletics?
Yeah, so I mentioned a few very small examples in the article that you referenced. So I know, I believe it, and I don't have the article in front of me, but I believe it was Texas A&M was one of them, and maybe the University of Michigan cutting jobs, maybe not filling extra positions. Maybe it's not layoffs, but maybe it's, we have an open position and we're not going to fill it. Cutting other programs, eliminating some programs and focusing on the programs that are making money. This is a really interesting anecdote, or I thought it was very interesting, from one of our colleagues who works with the University of Houston. So when they went to the Big 12 back in, I believe it was 2022, maybe 2023, they were expecting this big bump in revenue just from being in the Big 12. Right. And they shared with us that they thought that bump in revenue would offset most of the costs from revenue sharing. And I thought that was really interesting. I didn't realize that schools were that they were receiving that kind of income from the Big 12, or from the conference, I should say, not necessarily just the Big 12. And so, I'm sure that they're making small cuts in certain areas. Everybody's trying to save costs these days. It's always something that's on the brain. But I thought that was a really interesting observation, that they were pretty honest that they thought they would be just fine given the payouts that they're getting from the conference.
Interesting.
Yeah, and another development that sort of I've been interested in is just there's been talk. I don't know that there's any particular deals that have been finalized yet, but I know there definitely have been conversations of private equity getting involved with college sports and universities, and there's been some specific institutions that have been, identified in various media outlets as, engaging in these kinds of discussions. So I think this is something that, we're all watching with interest, just to see how this evolves. They're complicated arrangements, I'm sure. From an analytical perspective, if some of these come to fruition, we'll be spending some time discussing these, with the managements and and also presumably someone representing the athletic departments, of these institutions.
I'll mention one more thing. I apologize,
Yeah.
Karen, for interrupting. I
No.
just looked back at my notes, and another thing I thought was interesting, and I think we're seeing this in other areas as well, not just athletics, but board approved additional endowment draws to sort of
Okay.
offset some of those costs. So we've seen endowment loans, extraordinary endowment draws hike up pretty significantly over the last few years to offset costs from the pandemic, inflation, what have you. But interesting that the board is approving for a couple institutions, again, not across the board, but they've approved additional endowment draws in some cases to offset some of those athletics expenses, with the idea and the hope that fundraising will help them catch up.
Right. I think about, and this has been public information, so I'm not sharing anything out of school, but what has happened in the last 8 or 9 months at Virginia Tech. They came out in August with a massive 900-page board document that talked about how they were going to reinvent themselves and really become a global institution. And they had 4 different categories, of which athletics was one of them, which is fine. They're in the ACC conference. That makes sense to me. But then 3 games into the season, they fired their football coach. And all of a sudden, they've got to pay him and also pay the new coach, James Franklin from Penn State, to come in and give him all the support structure that he needed to recruit and out of with NIL and transfer portal. I think they ended up reallocating, I could be wrong, about $100 million by the end of September from their original plan in August. And I'm not exactly sure where that money came from, but it was reported widely in the media. And that was to make the football program whole. So when you see that kind of disruption where the coach is fired, a new coach comes in, they need resources, how do you look at that in terms of their overall, stability as an institution?
I see Ken's face. He looks ready to respond, so I'll let him start.
I'm reminded, Karen, just recently, University of Michigan had both a presidential vacancy, if you will, or, permanent presidential vacancy, and a football coach, situation. So I would hazard a guess, I haven't done this, but I would hazard a guess that if one were to do a word count relative to issues surrounding the replacement of those 2 positions, I would imagine the football coach took a lot more verbiage in the media than the presidential transition got, that was recently settled this past week, the presidential transition with the current president of Syracuse University making the move to University of Michigan. I think, the things that we're talking about, they just have so much importance to the colleges and universities on so many different levels that in many cases they take on a life bigger than themselves sometimes. And, and so we have to be aware of that relative to the job we do, because, institutions, colleges and universities can be affected in ways sometimes, frankly, we don't think about, and we're trained financial analysts, if you will, and that's the main portion of our focus. But so many of these things have, human dimensions and other dimensions that are, equally important. We have to be sensitive when we're talking to these colleges and universities about these kinds of things, as you might imagine. Our interest is basically getting as much information as we can about some of these situations, and then ascertaining whether or not they have financial implications that could affect their credit ratings. So, that's a difficult thing to do when you think about it, because there's so much sensationalism oftentimes in the media about these kinds of issues. And, we want to avoid being reactive based on something that is, sensationalist and not really having any material financial impact.
That's why I wanted to have you both on the podcast, because I don't think enough people really think about this, what this could mean for the stability going forward, for your decisions this year. One thing that you did talk about in the article, Beth, was some of this, the ratings and demand for enrollment and things like that on Division II and Division III programs. Mm-hmm. And, we don't think about that in the big, billion-dollar scale that we see in Division I. But these ratings decisions have a huge impact on the survival of some of the smaller schools that are also struggling with enrollment right now.
Absolutely. Yeah. Karen, I was really excited to give you this example because I met with this team right after you and I talked for the first time. So I met with St. Francis University, and this is all public information. So
Yeah.
I'm not sharing anything confidential. They announced that they were going to transition from D1 athletics to D3. So they're currently in their sort of last phase of D1. They'll start in D3 starting in fall 2026. We laughed about it in the meeting, but their basketball team made the tournament last year.
Yes.
So they knew, they had announced that they were going to transition, or maybe they hadn't announced yet, but they knew as a leadership team that they were going to transition to D3 for a variety of reasons. The main one being that the cost savings were going to be very significant.
Yeah.
Amongst other things, there were certainly other reasons. So, they made the tournament. Everyone's really excited. They lost, I believe, in the first round, but making the tournament is a feat, especially for a small school like them. And then after they made the tournament, the entire basketball team entered the transfer portal, and their retention went down, and all of their demand metrics suffered. Their enrollment went down. It's just been, it was expected. They knew this was going to happen. I think, and I respect and I really like the team at St. Francis. They're very aware. I'll say that. But it was pretty bad. They all transferred. They have a football team. Their football team went 0-11 last year, and several of those athletes transferred. And they're expecting heavy transfer portal activity this spring, just given that next fall they're starting, they're moving away from Division I athletics and into Division III athletics. And it's been a different beast for them. And again, we laughed about it, but really they were like, our entire basketball team entered the transfer portal. So, and I believe their coach left, or maybe they had hired a new coach very recently. And so they were like, so we got to get a whole new basketball team, and we're calling guys, and we're recruiting and we're doing our best, but I mean, it's having a significant impact on them. Go ahead. No, go ahead, Ken.
And we hear more often than not on these schools that are in the Division II and Division III that sometimes anywhere between 20 and 40% of their enrollment is derived from student athletes.
Right.
Yep.
So that's the relative significance of some of this, in terms of how we view it from a credit perspective, is just seeing that, the potential this can have on enrollment, as Beth just alluded to a moment ago.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. In fact, some of my colleagues have tracked on schools that have closed who had 60 or 70% of their population being athletes. So we're trying to figure out where's that line of demarcation where it's too dangerous financially to commit to too many sports, because sports are expensive, right?
Mm-hmm.
So how do you survive in this environment? Just give us a quick idea of what are the things in smaller schools, what other indicators do you pay attention to make sure that the school is sustainable and doing okay?
Liquidity, that's a big one. You started out, Karen. You started the train in my brain. Liquidity is a big one. Oh gosh, let's see. I mean, demand trends. So I think if you read any S&P article, we talk about trends all the time. So maybe 1 year of enrollment decline we're not overly concerned about unless it's 15 or 20%. But a trend of enrollment declines, certainly something we're concerned about. We have a threshold of students, and so it's 1,400, and anything under 1,400 students is something where it's not necessarily considered bad, but it's something we're keeping an eye on, particularly if enrollment declines are persisting. We pay close attention to selectivity and matriculation. And retention. Retention's another one that's really been affected by athletics. So when your whole basketball team enters the transfer portal, then your retention metric goes down, and it takes a while to improve that. And you're right. You're looking for transfer students, athletes or not, as well as financial. So to go back to your question, financial stability, financial sustainability, ability to have flexible expenses, things like that. I mean, those are all things we're keeping an eye on, particularly in smaller schools, and then I'll say also particularly in triple B category rated schools. So still investment grade, but triple B plus, triple B, and triple B minus rated institutions we keep a particular eye on all of those things I mentioned: liquidity, covenant violations, things like that.
That's a lot to think about. And of course, the overarching thing in the Northeastern, Mid-Atlantic, and Upper Midwest is this demographic cliff, which is hitting us right now. How much of that do you factor into your ratings?
I'll ask a different question and then I'll answer your question. How often do we talk about that? A lot. We talk about it a lot. I think we use the phrase demographic cliff in 75% of our articles. It's certainly something we're thinking about, something we're keeping an eye on. There's also a lot of competition in those regions. So that's a factor as well. How much does it factor into our ratings necessarily? It depends on the institution. And I know that's not a great answer, but it depends on all those other factors that I'm talking about. So if they have good liquidity, they have sustainable operations, their enrollment's been relatively stable, maybe we're not as concerned about the demographic trends, although we recognize the demographic trends.
Yeah, particularly, for example, at your really top public schools, public universities. Let's just throw out two rivals, Ohio State and Michigan. Both presumably would be in areas where the demographics might be a concern for other institutions in the state, but those schools have such very good reputations just in general and enrollment trends that it's not the same concern that it would be at a smaller school, let's just say.
Yeah. And there are a lot of small schools. Certainly in my home state of Pennsylvania, we are inundated with small Division III private schools. And you just wonder how they're going to manage this. And I know the work that you and other ratings agencies do is very, very important to their future and their planning. I want to read the last paragraph of Beth, of your article that you wrote. You said, overall, S&P Global anticipates that the financial and operational implications of the settlement will drive significant strategic adjustments across higher education institutions over the next decade. Can you give us an example of something you might have already seen schools doing in terms of adjusting to this new world?
Yeah, I think we've talked about a few of them today. You mentioned Virginia Tech, but reallocating funds, additional endowment draws, either making cuts to employee expenses, not filling vacant positions or eliminating employee positions, eliminating programs, adding additional fees. I know I mentioned University of Minnesota in my article, adding additional fees. I think we'll see more of that because it's a small way that schools can add revenue, heavy emphasis on fundraising. I also, another thing too, which is, I would say kind of in the opposite direction. I think a lot of schools are investing a lot in their infrastructure. So I've talked to a lot of our colleagues about schools building more suites at their football stadiums or making sure that the infrastructure is more up to date so that they can woo not only recruits, but they can woo fundraising opportunities. People want to come spend money at the stadium, spend, money on tickets, nice tickets, sweet tickets, or, club level, whatever it might be. So I think that's another, what I would consider in the opposite direction of making cuts is let's invest a little bit more. Let's spend a little bit more money for those that have it, I'll say, to make the experience such that we're going to then create revenue.
I'll give you two quick follow-on examples, Karen, if I may. One is the role of collectives and how that is changing by virtue of a new organization that's been set up is early on in its regulation of that type of activity, let's just say. And then a second is many of the colleges and universities, at least in the Division I, for example, have come to the realization that perhaps it's not sufficient just to have an athletic director but also the need for having a general manager. And so you find now that many of these schools have had to add general managers, to deal with some of these external matters that we're discussing.
I'll mention just one more thing that just came to mind based on what Ken was saying. I think being in Division I athletics means a lot more than it used to. It means something different than it used to. Division One used to be, you could be whatever size school you wanted to be. And if you were a Division One school, that was a way for you to recruit athletes. And certainly is more expensive, but you also received more money from the conference. And now I think a lot of people are rethinking, I mentioned St. Francis, but I've had conversations with other institutions as well. I think a lot of institutions are rethinking their placement in conferences, their placement in divisions. How are they going to move forward from a financial perspective and from a demand perspective, but mostly from a financial perspective? How are we going to move forward? How are we going to be a sustainable institution at this level?
And how do we drive brand awareness when we've relied on athletics for so long to help us
Absolutely.
with driving brand awareness? I think that's one of the biggest concerns that presidents that I talk to have. And we just don't realize how valuable of a product this has been for us for decades. And
Yeah.
certainly, as you said, for the larger institutions, public land grant, state institutions, I'm less worried about them than I am about all the other schools that are trying to find their place in this market right now. Beth and Ken, thank you so much for joining me today. I really appreciate it. This has been a great conversation.
Yeah.
Appreciate your insight and also being willing to talk to my listeners. Thank you.
Of course. Thanks so much for having us, Karen. This was so much fun.
You are more than welcome.